Hey class, welcome to chapter 2. Quick refresher of what we read in chapter 1. We learned a lot about Johnny and the family that he was living with, the Laphams, and we learned that Johnny is now working on a big project for Mr. Hancock. They have a week to complete it, and he was struggling with part of it, but he's starting to figure some of it out. And then we also, the very last little bit that we read was learning that Johnny's middle name was Light, and that he is probably related to the Light family, who is a very wealthy and rich family. Johnny told this to Scylla, but she promised to not tell anybody else. And so we might learn a little bit more. I'm assuming we'll learn more about that, and maybe that will lead to some other plot points coming up. So let's dive into chapter 2. These chapters are about 30 minutes long, so those that are following along or reading on your own, if you check out this video and decide you want to read on your own, just remember that. Give time to that. It will take some time. If you need a break, remember to pause, get up, stretch, get some water, get a snack, and then come back. You can also listen to this as you're getting ready for the day, eating your food, either breakfast or lunch or dinner, or maybe you can listen to this before you go to bed. That way you can cover the material, maybe multitask a little bit, those that are trying to catch up. All right, let's get into chapter 2, the pride of your power. The week wore on, each day as hot as the one before, for it was July. Every day after dinner, Mr. Lapham took a long nap under his basket, snoring as gently as he did everything else. Johnny would let him sleep for an hour, then wake him up, scold him, and get him to work. His work was beautiful. The body of the sugar basin was quickly completed, and he began reposing on it the rich garlands of fruit with the same skill he had 40 years before. Johnny's own work did not satisfy him as well. He had exactly enlarged the handle on his wax model. Mrs. Lapham and the girls, even Mr. Lapham, said it was fine, and he could go ahead and cast in silver. It was only Johnny himself who was dissatisfied. Friday evening, when the light was failing and work over, Johnny took the silver pitcher and his own wax model and left the shop. He was in Fish Street in a minute, stopping outside the silver shop of Paul Revere. He didn't dare knock, but he knew that any moment now the silversmith would be closing his shop, leaving for his dwelling in nearby North Square. He was so prosperous a smith that he did not live and work in the same place. So at last he saw Mr. Revere, a stocky, ruddy man with fine dark eyes, shutting his shop, taking out his key, preparing to lock up. "Good evening, Mr. Revere." The man smiled with a quick flash of white teeth. He had a quick smile and a quick face and body. "Good evening, Johnny Tremain." The boy had long admired Mr. Revere as the best craftsman in Boston. He had no idea Mr. Revere knew his name. He did not know all the master silversmiths had an eye on him. "Mr. Revere, I'd like to talk with you." Man to man, Mr. Revere agreed, opening his shop door, motioning Johnny to follow him. Johnny's eyes flew about the shop, taking in the fine anvils, the hood upon the annealing furnace, the neatness of crucibles. It was just such a shop he would himself have when he was a man grown, not much like Mr. Lapham's. Although Paul Revere was as busy a man as there was in all Boston, he took everything so easily in his stride, doing the one thing after another, that he never seemed rushed. So now, because an apprentice stopped him on the street and said he wanted to talk to him, he appeared to have all the time in the world. "Sir," said Johnny, "it's a matter of handles." He took the silver pitcher out of the cloth he had wrapped it in his own wax model, and explained Mr. Hancock's order. "So you want to talk to me as a silversmith to silversmith, do you?" He had Johnny's wax model in his hands, delicate hands to go with such heavy wrists. "What does your master say of your work?" "Mr. Lapham won't even look at it much, but he says it's good enough, and I can go ahead and cast tomorrow. I've got to cast tomorrow because it's Saturday, and we can't work Sunday, and it must be done Monday at 7. Although my master thinks it's all right, I'm not sure. He is wrong, and you are right. Look, you've just copied the handle on the pitcher too slavishly, just enlarged it. Don't you see that your winged woman looks coarse in comparison? I'd have the figures the same size on both pieces. Fill in with a scroll. Then, too, your curve is wrong. The basin is so much bigger you cannot use the same curve. Yours looks hunched up and awkward. It's all a matter of proportion." He took up a piece of paper and pencil and drew off what he meant with one sure sweep of his hand. "I'd use this curve more like that, see? This is what I meant when I said I'd add a scroll or two below the figure of the winged woman. not just enlarge her so she looks like a Boston fishwife in comparison to the angel on the picture. See? I see. The man looked at him and a little curious. There was a time, he said, when your own master could have shown you that. Mr. Lapham is, well, he's feeble, not doing very much work these days. Not what you'd call much, Johnny felt on the defensive. Not much fine hollow ware, plenty of buckles, spoons, and such. How many boys? 3 of us, sir. I'd hardly think he'd need 3. Now, if he wants to cut down, you tell him from me that I'll buy your unexpired time. I think between us we can make some fine things, you and I. The boy flushed to think the great Paul Revere wanted him. Tell your master I'll pay a bit more than is usual for you. Don't let him shunt one of those other boys off on me. He stood up. It was time for Johnny to go. I couldn't leave the Laphams, sir, he said as he thanked Mr. Revere. If it wasn't for me, nothing would have ever get done. They'd just about starve. I see. You're right, of course. But if the old gentleman dies and you never want a new master, remember my offer. So, and he turned to shake hands. May we meet again. By Saturday noon, Johnny followed Mr. Revere's advice and his curve. He had got the model of the handle exactly right. He could tell with his eyes closed. It felt perfect. He rapidly made a duplicate, for when the molten silver was poured in on the wax, it would melt and float away. He made a model for each handle. Now, no matter how long it took him, and if all went well, it should not be too long, he must get his handles cast, cleaned, and soldered to the basin itself, which Mr. Lapham had made. Of course, on Sunday the shop would be locked up all day, the furnace cold, and Mr. Lapham would, as always, escort his household, dressed in Sunday best, to the Cockerel Church, and after that back for a cold dinner. Whether they went again or not to afternoon meeting, the master left for each to decide. He himself always went. Madge and Dorcas usually entertained their beau. Mrs. Lapham slept solo, would take Asana out along the little beach. Johnny, Dove, and Dusty were apt to steal off for a swim. Although Mr. Lapham had no idea of it, he thought they sat quietly at home and that Johnny read the Bible out loud to them. So Sunday was out, but if he got up at 3 or 4 Monday morning, he would have time to clean his work before he took it over to Mr. Hancock at 7. After Saturday dinner, Mr. Lapham, as usual, prepared for his snooze, stretched out in the one armchair in the shop, with his basket over his head to keep off the flies. Perhaps Johnny's tyranny during the week had irritated the old gentleman, who never believed it made the least difference to anyone when anything was finished. Dove, Dusty, Johnny was yelling, build up the furnace, fetching charcoal. Hi, you lazy good-for-nothing dish mops. Dove ran out to the coal house. There was a queer, pleased look on his face when he returned. Charcoal all gone, Master Johnny. Gone? Yep, I haven't said anything because you always like to take charge of things like that round here. Get a basket, quick, run to Mr. Hamblin over on Long Wharf. Try Mrs. Hitchborn down on Hitchborn's Wharf. You've got to get charcoal. Hurry. Dove did not hurry. He was getting on toward sunset when at last he came back, pushing his big basket on a wheelbarrow. It was the worst-looking charcoal Johnny had ever seen. This isn't what we silversmiths use. This is fourth-rate stuff, fit for iron, maybe. You know that, Dove? Nah, not me. I don't know anything, see? You're always telling me. I want willow charcoal. You never said so. I'll go myself, but this delay means we'll be working in lamplight and up to midnight. You are the stupidest animal God ever made. If he made you, which I doubt. Why your mother didn't drown you when you were a pup, I can't imagine. Come Lord's Day and I have a spare moment, I'm going to give you such a hiding for your infernal low-down skulking tricks you'll be. The basket over Mr. Lapham's head moved. He laid it down. Boys, he said mildly, you quarrel all the time. Johnny, in angry mouthfuls, told him what he thought about Dove and the charcoal, and threw a cutting remark about Dusty. The old master said, Dove, I want to speak to Johnny alone. And then, Johnny, I don't want you to be always riding them boys so hard. Dove tries, but he's stupid. Ain't his fault, is it? If God had wanted him bright, he would have made him that way. We're all poor worms. You're getting above yourself, like I tried to point out to you. God is going to send you a dire punishment for your pride. Yes, sir. One trouble with you is you haven't been up against any boys as good as yourself, or better maybe, because you're the best young one in this shop, or on Hancock's Wharf. You think you're the best one in the world. Johnny was so anxious to be with the work, tediously delayed by Dove's tricks, he hardly listened. And boy, don't you go get all fretted up over what's after all nothing but an order for silver. It's sinful to let yourself go so over mundane things. Now I want you to sit quietly and memorize them verses I had you read about pride. Work's over for the day. What? Yep, it always was the old-fashioned way to start Lord's Day at sunset on Saturday. Now I've decided to reestablish the habit in my house. Mr. Lapham, we've got to work this evening. We've promised Mr. Hancock. I doubt God cares even a little bit whether Mr. Hancock has any silver. It's better to break faith with him, isn't it, than with the Lord? Johnny was tired. His head was ringing. His hands shook a little. He walked out of the shop, slamming the door after him, and stormed into the kitchen. He knew Mrs. Lapham did not take much stock in her father-in-law's pious ways. She and all 4 girls were in the kitchen. Madge was frying cornmeal, Dorcas wringing out a cheesecloth, Scylla was setting the table, and Asana playing with the cat. Mrs. Lapham looked at him. Boy, have you seen a ghost? Johnny sat and told a story. He was beyond his customary abusive eloquence. The girls stared at him with piteous open mouths. Mrs. Lapham's jaw set grimly. Dorcas, shut that door. Don't let your grandpa hear. Johnny, how many more work hours will you need? 7, maybe. I can get 2 Monday morning. You shall have them. Sabbath or no Sabbath, that sugar basin is going to be done on time. I'm not letting any old-fashioned, fussy notions upset the best order we've had for 10 years. And if Mr. Hancock is pleased, he may come again and again. I can't have my poor fatherless girls starve just to please Grandpa. Listen now to me. Sunday afternoon, Mr. Lapham was not only going to the second service as usual, but there was to be a meeting of the deacons, a cold supper afterward, and a prayer service at the pastor's. That's where you get them 5 hours, Johnny, tomorrow afternoon. Johnny knew that working on the Sabbath was against the law as well as against all his religious training. He might very well go to the stocks or to hell for it. But when Mrs. Lapham said, Darest to Johnny, he said, I darest. Not a word to the old gentleman, mind, not a word. Girls, if you so much as peep. Oh no, Ma. Dove and Dusty were to be bribed into the service by the promise of delivering the basin to Mr. Hancock when done. He always gave money to boys who brought things to the house. Mrs. Lapham was breathing hard, but she had the matter well in hand. It was settled. Asana, she said quietly, you call Grandpa and the boys in to supper. Scylla, run down cellar and fetch cold ale. Her mouth and the folds about it, even her nose and eyes were like iron. Sunday afternoon the work went forward with never a hitch. Even Dove and Dusty were good and obedient. Although Dove was half threatening to tell old Grandpa, when he got home Johnny did not care what his master might say. Only please God, the basin were done, and Mr. Hancock come again and again with his rich orders. If Mr. Lapham was angry, he could sell Johnny's time to Paul Revere. The 4 girls, still dressed in their pretty go-to meeting frocks, watched him with fascinated, admiring eyes. Their mothers sent them out of doors. Did the smoke from the furnace show from the wharf? From Fish Street? Did they hear any comments? Having found for himself the proper willow charcoal, Johnny went quickly ahead with his casting. He set his 2 wax models in wet sand. The furnace was piping hot. His hands were very sure. He was confident he could do the work, yet inside he was keyed up and jumpy. Mrs. Lapham fussed about him, and he ordered her to do simple things. Not the draft yet. Mrs. Lapham, now get to work with the bellows. Once he even told her to look sharp, and she took it with a humble, yes, Johnny. Now fetch me the crucible. She turned to Dove. Which one does he want, boy? I'll get her down. Dove went to the shelves where the crucibles for melting silver were kept. Johnny did not see Dove standing on a stool, reaching far back and carefully taking out a cracked crucible. Dusty saw him and giggled. He knew the crack in it was so small it was hard to even see. It might stand the heat of the furnace, but the chances were that it would not. That was why Mr. Lapham had put it so far back. Both he and Dove thought it would just above serve Johnny Tremain right. After the insufferable way he had been bossing everybody, if the crucible gave way and the hot silver did spill all over the top of the furnace, he would certainly make Johnny look like a fool, after all his fussing. Johnny took the cracked crucible in his trusting hands, put in silver ingots, set it on top of the furnace. Scylla flew in. Ma, there's a man looking at our chimney. How's he dressed? Seafaring man. No, seafaring man have ever objected to a little Sabbath break-in. But mind if you see any deacons or constables. The work went on. Asana sat with the cat in her lap. Johnny's going to hell, she said firmly. Johnny himself thought this was possible. He called to Mrs. Lapham to look sharp and put the old silver turnip watch where he could see it. The silver must be run at a certain speed and be allowed to cool for just so long. Mrs. Lapham was so slavishly eager to help him, he almost felt fond of her. He did not notice Dusty and Dove snickering in the corner. Some of the beeswax he had used for his models had been left too near the furnace. It had melted and run over the floor. Johnny had been taught to clean up as he went along, but today he was in too much of a hurry to bother. "Johnny," cried Mrs. Lapham, "isn't it time to pour? Look, the silver has melted and begun to wink." It was true. He moved forward delicately, his right hand outstretched. The crucible began to settle, collapse. The silver was running over the top of the furnace like spilled milk. Johnny jumped toward it, his right hand still outstretched. Something happened. He never knew exactly what. His feet went out from under him. His hand came down on the top of the furnace. The burn was so terrible he at first felt no pain, but stood stupidly looking at his hand for 1 second before the melted cooled. The inside of his right hand from wrist to fingertips was coated with solid silver. He looked at the back of his hand. It was as always. Then he smelled burned flesh. The room blackened and tipped around him. He heard a roaring in his ears. When he came to, he was stretched out upon the floor. Dorcas was trying to pour brandy down his throat. Mrs. Lapham had plunged the burned hand into a panful of flour and was yelling at Madge to hurry with her bread poultice. He saw Scylla's face. It was literally green. "Ma," she said, licking her white lips, "shall I run for Dr. Warren?" "No, no. Oh, wait, I've got to think. I don't want any of them doctors to know we was breaking Sabbath day. And we don't need no doctor for just a burn. Scylla, you run down the wharf and you fetch that old midwife. Gran Hopper, these old women know better than any doctor how to cure things like this. Johnny, how you feel? All right? Hurt yet? Not yet." He knew it would later. Johnny lay in the birth and death room. This was hardly more than a closet with a tiny window off the kitchen, used for storage except in times of sickness. His hand had been done up in a linseed poultice. The smell of the linseed was stifling, and now, on the second day, the pain had already begun. His arm throbbed to the shoulder. Gran Hopper was in the kitchen talking to Miss Lapham. "Mind you keep that poultice wet. Just leave it wrapped up and wet it now and then with lime water. There's more luck than anything else in things like this. If it don't come along good, I'll make a charm." Not many years before, Gran Hopper would have been hanged for a witch. She had the traditional venerable years, the toothless cackle, the mustache, nor was she above resorting to charms. But she had had vast experience. No doctor in Boston knew more than she about midwifery and children's diseases. So far she had done as well as any of them, except for one thing. The hand had been allowed to draw together. Turning it on itself, it was less painful than it had been held out flat. But the fourth day ulceration had set in. This was considered nature's way of healing an injury. Gran Hopper gave him laudanum and more laudanum. There followed drowsy days and nights that ran together, a ceaseless roaring in the ears. There was nothing left of him but the pain and the drug. The fever abated, and with it the doses of the drug. Johnny had not once looked at his hand since he had stood before the furnace and seen it lined with silver. Gran Hopper said on the next day she would unwrap it and see, as she cheerfully put it, what was left. Thus far the pain and the drug and the fever had dulled his mind. He had not thought about the future, for of what use to any one was a cripple-handed silversmith? But that night Gran Hopper's words haunted him. Next day she would see what was left. He was utterly unprepared for the sight of his hand when finally it was unwrapped and lay in the midwife's apron lap. Mrs. Lapham, Madge, Dorcas, all had crowded into the little birth and death room. Scylla and Asana were in the kitchen, too frightened to go near him. "My," said Madge, "isn't that funny looking? The top part. Johnny looks all right, although a little narrow. But Johnny, your thumb and palm have grown together." This was true. He bent and twisted his fingers. He could not get the thumb to meet the forefinger. Such a hand was completely useless. For the first time he faced the fact that his hand was crippled. "Oh, let me see." Dorcas was leaning over him. She gave her most elegant little screech of horror, just like a great lady who has seen a mouse. "My," said Mrs. Lapham, "that's worse than anything I had imagined. Now isn't that a shame? Bright boy like Johnny just ruined, no more good than a horse with sprung knees." Johnny did not stay to hear more. That morning he had dressed with Mrs. Lapham's competent help for the first time. He got up, stood facing them stiffly, his bad hand jammed into his breeches pocket. "I'm going out," he said thickly. Scylla and Asana sat closely together in a frightened huddle. Staring at him, not daring to speak, he said rudely, "You should have come in too and seen the fun." Scylla gaped at him, tried to say something, but only swallowed. "You too," sitting there, looking like a couple of fishes. He slammed the front door after him. He had always been bad about slamming doors. In the fresh air, he felt better. He pretended not to hear Mrs. Lapham calling him from a window to come right back. All Fish Street could hear when Mrs. Lapham called. He paid no heed. He walked all over Boston, his hand thrust deep in his breeches pocket. Instinctively, he wanted to tire himself out, which was easy in his weakened condition, so he could not think. When he came back, there was something queer about the silence of the kitchen. No one reproved him because he had disobeyed Mrs. Lapham. He knew that they had been talking about him. Scylla, for one of the first times in her life, tried to be polite to him. "Oh, Johnny," she whispered, "I'm sorrier than I was ever sorry before." Santa said, "It is true. Like Ma says, you'll be only good for picking rags." Scylla turned on Isana. "You're crazy. Johnny isn't going to pick rags. But oh, Johnny, it's so awful, and I'm so sorry." And Johnny's face was crimson. "Will you stop talking about it?" Santa went on. "Madge says it looks awful. If either of you girls," he stormed, "ever mention that I've even got a hand, I'll just get on a ship and never come back. I'm not going to have you mucking about with your infernal crybaby. Oh, how dreadfuls." So he went to the shop. He saw with anger that Dove was sitting at his bench, staring to use his tools. He had not been in the shop for a month. Of course, it had been expected that Dove would use his bench for a little while, just until he was back at it himself. Mr. Lapham had looked up from his work, blinked gently, shook his head, and sighed. Dusty was making a terrific din in one corner. Johnny stood and watched Dove's clumsy work as long as he could in silence. At last he burst out, "Dove, don't hold your crippling iron like that." Dove leaned back, his fat, white face grinned up at him with exaggerated innocence. "Thank you, Master Johnny. I know I'm not as good as you are. Won't you please to show me just how I should hold my crippling iron?" Johnny walked out of the shop by the door leading to the wharf. He'd never show anybody again how to hold a crippling iron. If you can't do, you had best shut up. He started to slam the door, thought better of it. If you can't do, you'd best not slam doors. So he strolled the length of the wharf. There was a big ship in from Jamaica. He idly watched porters rolling barrels of molasses out of its hold. A sailor was trying to sell an old lady a parrot. He saw John Hancock standing in a group of men. The sugar basin had never been delivered. When Mr. Lapham had discovered the evil that had gone on in his absence and the terrible punishment God had meted out to Johnny Tremain, he had ordered the whole thing melted down, and he himself had gone over to Mr. Hancock, returned the cream pitcher, and merely said he had found it impossible to make a sugar basin. No explanation. The boy was accustomed to working from 8 to 12, sometimes 14 hours in a day. He had no holidays, no Saturday afternoons. He had often imagined to himself the pleasure it would be just to stroll once down Hancock's wharf, as he was strolling now. Nothing to do, his hands in his pockets. Other boys, friends of his, would look up from their work, envy his idleness. Here and there he did see a familiar face. He believed every one of them was talking about his burn, pitying him. There was not a boy on the wharf Johnny did not know. He had made friends with some and enemies of others, and had played or fought with all of them. He saw Saw and Dicer packing salt, herrings in a tub, Andy his leather thimble strapped to his palm, sewing a sail, Tom Drinker, the local bully, coopering a barrel. This was Johnny's world, but now he walked through it an alien. They knew what had happened. They did not envy Johnny's idleness. He saw one nudge another. They were whispering about him, daring to pity him. Dicer's master, the herring pickler, yelled some kind of remark to him, but Johnny did not answer. Seemingly in one mouth, he had become a stranger, an outcast on Hancock's wharf. He was maimed, and they were whole. At the end of the wharf, under the derrick used for unloading the largest ships, he stripped off his clothes and dove into the water. There was not another working boy in Boston who was out swimming in the middle of the afternoon. Only once or twice in the summer, on days of unendurable heat, teachers dismissed school, masters closed shops, and the boys ran down to the wharves to swim. Sometimes, like Mr. Lapham's boys, they swam secretly, silently on Sunday afternoons, but usually only after dusk had fallen and the day's work was over. Johnny dove and swam, but it was curious to be alone. He did not like the feeling of being thus cut off from his normal life. Yet one thing gave him great pleasure. Once in the water, his bad hand was as good as the other. Swimming, he could forget it. At first, Mrs. Lapham tended to humor the poor boy. as he preferred the birth and death room to the attic with Dove and Dusty. She had let him stay on. He had never in all his life slept in a bed alone, much less a whole room. He wanted to be alone. There was one trouble with his new quarters. When Mrs. Lapham came down to start breakfast, she always began by getting him up. "Get into your clothes, you lazy boy. Stop by at Deacon's parson for a quart of milk. Get to the town pump." Soon enough, she was addressing him as a lazy good-for-nothing, a lug-a-bed, a worthless limb of Satan. Such words poured out of her absent-mindedly, but never in the old days had she called Johnny such names. The boy least necessary in the shop had always done chores. Now both Dove and Dusty were more valuable than Johnny Tremain. Every morning he put on the heavy wooden yoke, trudged over to North Square for drinking water. Now for the first time he learned to handle a broom properly. He carried in charcoal for the annealing furnace in the shop and wood for the cooking hearth in the kitchen. And as he moved restlessly about doing and often failing to do this humble work, Scylla and Asana watched him and said little. Never a single insult. He had made it clear to them he wanted to be left alone. Madge and Dorcas found innumerable small tasks for him. Now he wasn't doing anything. Once fat Madge made him sit before her holding a skein of yarn from which she wound a ball. He was miserable, with his crippled hand stretched out for all the world to see. When she mentioned it, he threw the yarn at her head and walked off. One day Mr. Lapham called to him and led him to a bench under the old willow behind the coal house. The old man had never once berated him for Sabbath breaking, never reminded him how often he had pointed out that pride goeth before a fall. "My boy," he said mildly, "soon it will be September. Summer is over." Johnny nodded. "And I feel I must talk with you. When I signed for you, Johnny, there was a mutual contract between your mother and myself. She's dead, so the contract is now between you and me. I promised to feed and clothe you, keep you in good discipline, and as far as your capacity permitted, to teach you the silversmith's arts and mysteries. I never had a boy so quick to teach, and you promised to serve me diligently for 7 years, to keep my secrets and my honor. You've done all that, Johnny, but now I can't keep my contract with you. I can't teach a crippled-handed boy to be a silversmith." Johnny said nothing. "Mrs. L is right," the old man went on. "You mean she wants you to get rid of me?" "Not exactly, but she does think it is an extravagance for a poor household to keep a boy just for chores. But I've told her." There was an unexpected glint of determination in the groping old eyes. "I've told her as long as you wish you are to stay with us, I won't ever turn you out. I mind the time your mother came to my shop with you. She was a sweet lady, very genteel. She said your heart was fastened on being a silversmith. She said you was a bright boy. You always was that. Now, Johnny, it's for your own good I'm talking to you. You've got to learn another way of supporting yourself. I want you to go around, look about the shops, and find a respectable trade where a bad hand won't matter too much. You're a bright boy, Johnny. Maybe a rope maker or a cooper or a weaver could teach you his craft. That hand of yours will be strong enough, but will always be sort of doubled in on itself." Johnny started to look at his hand, but quickly thrust it back in his pocket. "You're right," he said. "I've got to go. I don't want you to feel hurried about leaving us, Johnny. You're just about earning your keep by the odd jobs you do, spite of what Mrs. L says. You look about you quietly and find a trade to your fancy and a master you think you'd like. You can tell him from me I'll give the rest of your time away for nothing." It was less than 2 months ago Mr. Revere was promising something extra for his time. "Mrs. L doesn't like it the way you loiter off and go swimming, but you loiter and swim all you have in mind, just so you get the chores done and settle down real hard to find yourself a new trade. And one more thing I have on my mind. Yes, sir, I want you to forgive Dove like a Christian." "Forgive him? Why?" Why, that when you asked for a crucible, he handed you the old cracked one. You mean he did it on purpose?" No, Johnny. He only meant to humiliate you. He tells Mrs. L made me question him, that he was that offended by your Sabbath break-in, he thought it fitting that you should learn a lesson. I can't help but admit I'm encouraged with that much pity in one of you, my boys." Johnny's voice sounded strangled. "Mr. Lapham, I'm going to get him for that." "Hush, hush, boy, I say, and Bible says forgive. He was real repentant when he told me. Never meant to harm you. He was in tears. He's going to be in a lot more of those tears before I'm done with him. That scabby white louse, that hypocrite. Hold your tongue, boy. I thought misfortune had taught you patience." "It has," said Johnny. "If I have to, I'll wait 10 years to get that Dove." But he quieted himself instantly and thanked his master for his kindness. As he walked past the shop, he saw Dove and Dusty hanging idly out of the shop window. They were looking for him. Dove said, "Will Mr. Johnny Tremain be so kind as to fetch us drinking water? Mrs. Lapham says we are too valuable to leave our benches. She told us we were to send you." Without a word, he went to the back entry, put on the heavy yoke. Understandably, the sight of Johnny wielding a broom, carrying charcoal, firewood, water, and not quickly lost its fascination for his erstwhile slaves. They were still hanging out of the window. "Look sharp, Johnny." "Hey, boy, look sharp." Giggles. A low whistle. Johnny said nothing. Looks like Johnny Tremain walking around, getting all the people working. All right, that is chapter 2. I will see you guys in chapter 3.